Hi, I'm Jedi Master Josh, and today we're going to talk about the Category 5 political firestorm that has been thrust onto the scene as of yesterday when former chief executive of Breitbart and also former chief strategist for the Trump administration, Steve Bannon, allegedly was quoted saying some rather shady things about the president and his son. It is taking the entire political world by storm, and there are a lot of questions out there, a lot of different opinions, a lot of different views, a lot of misinformation as well. So I'm hopefully going to try to clear a little bit of this all up for everybody. So first I want to start with the original piece that supposedly had this quote from Bannon in it. And it is from The Guardian, which is a left-leaning European website. I believe it's British. And it is basically quoting from this book from a fella named Michael Wolff, and we'll get into him in a little bit. So from The Guardian, Trump Tower meeting with Russians, quote, treasonous, Bannon says in explosive book. Donald Trump's former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, had described the Trump Tower meeting between the president's son and a group of Russians during the 2016 election campaign as, quote, treasonous and unpatriotic, according to an explosive new book seen by The Guardian. Bannon, speaking to author Michael Wolff, warned that the investigation into alleged collusion with the Kremlin will focus on money laundering and predicted, quote, they're going to crack Don Jr. like an egg on national TV. So some very interesting quotes allegedly from Steve Bannon. Now, right after this, or shortly after this article was published, there was actually an official statement from the president. For a little while, people questioned whether it actually was an official statement, something that Trump actually put out himself, and indeed it was, and it turns out to be a historically scathing presidential statement, and I'm going to read it here to you right now. So this is from the excerpt of it is from Bloomberg. Quote, Steve Bannon has nothing to do with me or my presidency. When he was fired, he not only lost his job, he lost his mind. Steve was a staffer who worked for me after I had already won the nomination by defeating 17 candidates, often described as the most talented field ever assembled in the Republican Party. Now he is on his own. Now that he is on his own, Steve is learning that winning isn't as easy as I made it look. Steve had very little to do with our historic victory, which was delivered by the forgotten men and women of this country. Yet Steve had everything to do with the loss of a Senate seat in Alabama held for more than 30 years by Republicans. Burn. Steve doesn't represent my base. He's only in it for himself. Steve pretends to be at war with the media, which he calls the opposition party, yet he spent his time at the White House leaking false information to the media to make himself seem far more important than he was. It is the only thing he does well. Steve was rarely in a one-on-one meeting with me and only pretends to have had influence to fool a few people with no access and no clue, whom he helped write phony books. We have many great Republican members of Congress and candidates who are very supportive of the Make America Great Again agenda. Like me, they love the United States of America and are helping to finally take our country back and build it up, rather than simply seeking to burn it all down. So basically, Steve Bannon just got the third-degree burn from the President of the United States. It's basically like, he just got dropped into, the Rancor pit or the Zarlak pit from Star Wars to, basically digest slowly over 1,000 years. This was brutal. An absolutely brutal statement from the President of the United States, and it was also followed up by a fairly scathing tweet from Donald Trump Jr. as well, saying, quote, "Steve had the honor of working in the White House and serving the country. Unfortunately, he squandered that privilege and turned that opportunity into a nightmare of backstabbing, harassing, leaking, and lying and undermining the president. Steve is not a strategist, he is an opportunist." So, very explosive revelations, some craziness going on for sure. And it definitely shows that, bare minimum, there was obviously some serious tensions between members of Trump's family and Trump himself and Steve Bannon. Apparently, there was some serious tensions there. It's something that had probably been building up for quite a while, and then sort of just exploded onto the scene in this fashion. Now, with Steve Bannon in this quote, there are some people who are questioning whether or not Steve Bannon actually said this, because obviously it's an insane thing that Steve Bannon would come out and say that the meeting between Don Jr. And the Russian lawyer, which is what he's referring to, was treasonous. I mean, that's just an insane thing. That's literally a Maxine Waters, talking point. So, completely insane that Bannon would potentially say something like this, and the author of the book has definitely been called into question, and rightly so. And that brings me to InfoWars. And if you hate InfoWars, go find a straw and figure out what to do with it. Author claiming Bannon called Don Jr. meeting treasonous, known for inventing changing quotes. An investigation by now-defunct media watchdog site Brill's Content claimed that Wolf's book Burn Rate distorted the truth and contained apparent factual errors. Brill's reported that sources Wolf mentioned complained that he had, quote, invented or changed quotes attributed to them. In 2004, the New Republic's Michael Cottle also claimed, quote, "the scenes in Wolf's columns aren't recreated so much as created, springing from Wolf's imagination rather than from actual knowledge of events." In 2010, the Columbia Journalism Review, analyzing a Wolf article about a phone hacking scandal related to Rupert Murdoch, criticized his work as, quote, "pathetic, disgusting, twisted, and based on, quote, zero evidence." So certainly the guy has some credibility issues, and when it comes to this particular book that was that is about to be put out by this guy, Michael Wolff, there are people who are coming out and saying that in fact he did make up quotes and attribute it to them. And this is a tweet from Maggie Halberman of the New York Times, who says, Barack, and that would be Tom Barack, he's a real estate investor and a acquaintance, ally of Trump. Barack, not Barack Obama, said he spoke to Wolf once, says he never said the quote attributed to him to Wolf or anyone. Quote, totally false, Barack said by phone just now. And this is a reporter from the New York Times saying this. And then in another tweet, she says, Tom Barack adds, quote, it's clear to anyone who knows me that those aren't my words and inconsistent with anything I've ever said. He says Wolf never ran that quote by him to ask if it was accurate. So this guy has some pretty legitimate criticism in terms of his ability to factually and accurately recreate events. It seems that he's got a pretty bad track record in that area. It seems that he, in some cases, exaggerates events, and in other cases, completely, fabricates quotes and fabricates all sorts of different things, apparently. So that is certainly problematic. And now I want to look at an actual excerpt from this upcoming book, Fire and Fury. Bannon got Stephen Miller to write the Immigration EO, which is the Trump's immigration executive order banning travel from several countries. Miller, a 55-year-old trapped in a 32-year-old's body, was a former Jeff Sessions staffer brought onto the Trump campaign for his political experience. Except, other than being a dedicated far-right conservative, it was unclear what particular abilities accompanied Miller's political views. He was supposed to be a speechwriter, but if so, he seemed restricted to bullet points. So that's an actual excerpt from this upcoming book from Michael Wolff. And this is one of many claims that are being disputed in this book. And I'm not going to go over too many of them, but I'm going to go over several of them. And that brings me now to a tweet from John Podhoretz of the New York Post, who says, "I'm no fan of Miller," who would be Stephen Miller, who is an advisor to President Trump, someone who does in fact write some of his speeches. I'm no Miller fan, but the idea that he didn't know anything about immigration policy is absurd. He worked on it with Sessions for years. This is why you can't trust Wolff's assertions, which often demonstrate his own blithe ignorance. So this reporter from the New York Post, says he's somebody who doesn't particularly like Stephen Miller, but that this portrayal of Stephen Miller from Michael Wolff's book is clearly inaccurate. So this is an issue that is pretty clear with this guy. It seems like this guy Michael Wolff, creates basically fiction in many ways, and even the Washington Post has pointed out that this guy likes to, let's say, maybe stretch the truth just a little bit. Michael Wolff's unbelievable, sometimes literally, tell-all about the Trump administration. In one passage from Fire and Fury inside the Trump White House, Wolff recounts how Roger Ailes recommended former House Speaker John A. Boehner to serve as Trump's chief of staff. Trump's response, according to Wolff, quote, "Who's that?" Give me a break. Never mind that Trump had golfed with Boehner in 2013 and mentioned him several times on the 2016 campaign trail. I mean, the idea, this just fits into the Democrat, talking point that President Trump, the Russian collusion narrative is basically collapsing before our very eyes. So what you're seeing now is them trying to sort of shift in certain ways, and they're now focusing more and more on Trump's mental health. Is Trump sane? Is he going to, and throw us all into World War III with Kim Jong-un over Twitter? The first Twitter bombs have been dropped in World War III already, so it's already started. And so clearly, even the Washington Post is calling out the fact that this guy, has a pretty bad record when it comes to credibility. But there is a problem. There is definitely some issues. So you've seen people. You've seen Tom Barrack, for example. He came out and he said, "Look, what this guy said is wrong. This I never said that. It's clearly a fabrication." And again, clearly this guy has a bunch of BS in this book. But that doesn't mean that everything in it isn't true. And one big issue for Steve Bannon is it seems like there may actually be tapes of the interviews. Now, the thing is, Steve Bannon hasn't actually came out and said that he didn't say those things. He's basically blown it off. In a radio appearance, he basically said that, I love the president. Didn't even really acknowledge the accusations or the quotes that were attributed to him. So that's very concerning that he hasn't come out and outright said that he didn't say that. On top of that, again, it seems like there may actually be recordings of these conversations that he had with Wolff. And we know, according to Sarah Sanders, the White House press secretary, that this fellow Wolff, Michael Wolff, who did have access to the West Wing, to the White House, seems like he had access to the White House because of Steve Bannon. Now, there is a cease and desist order. So after this, Trump was obviously furious about, these allegations. This report in The Guardian that was put out, he had that epically scathing statement, but he also had his lawyers come out and issue a cease and desist order to Bannon, and basically said to not, to basically shut your mouth about the defamatory things that you're saying about the Trump's family, Trump's son Don Jr. in particular. But the problem with the cease and desist order is actually explained quite well by Lee Stranahan on The Real News with David Knight this morning on David Knight's radio broadcast. And I want to play a clip of that because Lee Stranahan is a interesting figure because he actually worked at Breitbart. He also worked at the Huffington Post, so he's worked at both liberal and conservative outlets. He does know Bannon personally, and he has connections to Breitbart still to this day. So I want to play a clip of him from David Knight's radio show, and I want to let him explain why, first off, the cease and desist order isn't a valid excuse, and also to give you a little bit of inside detail on what may be possibly going on with the situation.
Well, let's be super clear here. There's nothing in a cease or desist order that was given to Bannon about non-disparagement that would have kept Steve from saying the following. Those statements attributed to me are completely false. I don't think the meeting was treasonous or unpatriotic. And I want to be clear on that. That cease and desist letter was about don't disparage the president. It wasn't don't correct the record. He's had multiple opportunities. He hosted a radio show for 3 hours last night. Then he hosted the radio show for a couple hours this morning as well. And he refused to comment on it. Yeah. He didn't. If it were me, I would have done it first thing. Let's look at the facts on what Steve did after he left the White House. Steve is not happy that he was fired from the White House. He lied about it, and there's no other way to put it, and said, well, I meant to, the Pee Wee Herman defense, I meant to do that, right? I meant to leave the White House. Well, in fact, that's not what happened. He was forced out. Furthermore, and I know that from Steve's friends, Steve doesn't want the president to succeed without Steve Bannon. And I can tell you, a top editor at Breitbart, and I'm trying to get permission to release this publicly, but a top editor from Breitbart said yesterday that it's not the Trump train, it's the Breitbart train, and that they're in charge. So the internal attitude at Breitbart was that they're responsible for Trump's victory. You got to remember the timeline here. Let's get this right. These are not statements that were made by Steve Bannon yesterday.
Right.
These are statements that were made by Steve Bannon at some point in the past. And apparently, if this stuff about Wolf is true, and I believe it is, then why was Steve talking to this guy? And in other words, it's very easy for people were able to do research on Michael Wolff and find out the reputation that he has. Then why did Steve sit down for interview after interview after interview with this guy? There were also people on the outside who were pretending that Steve, they let it be, they let people think that Bannon was leaking to them. And these are people who never worked for Breitbart, had nothing to do. I know for a fact, Steve was talking to people at Breitbart, and some information was getting it out. And I also believe he may have been talking to some reporters from the New York Times, for instance. Maggie Halberman, I want to be specific about that. That's who I think Steve probably was talking to.
So the cease and desist order is, clearly not an excuse whatsoever. There's no reason for him to not come out and say that he didn't, in fact, say these things unless he did actually say those things. But on top of that, it's pretty clear at this point that Steve Bannon was leaking quite a bit, leaking to Breitbart, leaking to the New York Times, and doing this always to make himself seem like the hero, basically. He always wanted to put himself center stage, And in many ways, it seems like he was using Breitbart not as so much a legitimate news organization, but more so as his own, sort of private political entity, an extension of his own political ambitions and motivations, as opposed to, sort of actual independent journalism. And then, of course, Steve Bannon was actually fired. He was let go. So it's pretty clear at this point that there was some serious friction between Bannon and Team Trump, and that he was actually seen as a liability. So it's amazing. Now, after this happened, now the aftermath of this is absolutely insane. You've got a massive conservative pile-on just completely excoriating, just destroying, demolishing, steamrolling, obliterating Steve Bannon, and it's spectacular to witness. It's truly insane how quickly something like this can happen. How the tides can turn, and I think there's just, conservative commentators and personalities across the board are completely bashing Bannon, but I think it gets summed up perfectly by a tweet from Dana Loesch, who says, Steve Bannon tried to do it to the Trump presidency what he did to Breitbart News. Trump's nuclear button was bigger. And that is just absolutely, true. Obviously, Trump's got the biggest, reddest button ever. Ever, and mine actually works. So it's just incredible to see this just overflow of just absolute vilification and just the downright destruction of Steve Bannon. It was swift, for sure, swift and thorough. And so you've got this whole crazy situation that's going on right now. It seems like Steve Bannon did actually say those things. It seems like Steve Bannon did, in fact, set up the majority of these meetings with Michael Wolff, and that he was routinely leaking to the media, causing all sorts of trouble for the Trump presidency, all to sort of try to prop himself up and position himself up as basically George Washington 2.0, when I guess he didn't get the memo that nobody voted for Steve Bannon. So it was just insane. It seems like he, massively overplayed his hand, and this just truly seems like an insane move on Steve Bannon's part. Also, his funding from the Mercer family has basically been cut. They were a massive funder of Breitbart News. And even the comments in Breitbart News, Steve Bannon's own publication, basically are absolutely trashing him. So yes, he is basically done for by any stretch of the imagination. Completely, just sucked into his own black hole of selfish narcissism. But now that he's lost his funding from the Mercers, there's a very interesting revelation. Now it turns out he may have found a new sugar daddy. So that brings me to a tweet from Matt Drudge. Steve Bannon finding opportunity and happiness in the arms of a new billionaire benefactor, Miles Kwok, a.k.a. Guo Win Gui. I probably just butchered that. My apologies. Mercer is yesterday's mashed potatoes. Interesting little bit of Matt Drudge wit there. So who is this fellow? Well, it turns out that Mr. Miles Kwok, in a piece from the Washington Times, it says, according to a 2017 New York Times article covering Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit with Trump in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, which is where Trump, had chocolate cake with the president, dictator of China. He is a billionaire who made his fortune in real estate. He has been called a narcissist. He posted to Twitter incessantly about politics and battles against the media. Lately, he has been spending time at a Florida resort named Mar-a-Lago. more. He built a fortune in the Darwinian world of Chinese real estate, and people who crossed him soon rued the day. In 2006, he handed the police a sex tape of a Beijing deputy mayor who had disputed one of his land deals. The official was imprisoned, and Mr. Guo got the property, building the torch-shaped Pangu Plaza next to Beijing's Olympic Green, a landmark during the 2008 Summer Games. He kept his extensive car collection in a vast underground parking lot, arranging the dozens of Ferraris, Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, and Bugattis in petal shapes to show to visitors, said one person who knows him. He is in a long-running public battle with China's most prominent journalist, Hu Shuli, whose magazine Cakesin, man, I'm really bad at this, reported in 2015 that Mr. Gao used his ties to Ma Jian, a former vice minister in the country's spy agency, to further his business interests. Mr. Ma was expelled from the Communist Party. Don't misgender Mr. Ma. Don't misgender Mr. Ma. Was expelled from the Communist Party and is being prosecuted on graft charges, rather. Mr. Guo accused Mrs. Hu of being corrupt and working for behind-the-scenes power broker. Cakesin sued Mr. Guo, saying he defamed Mrs. Hu. Wow, that was a little bit hard to get through right there. So basically, this guy's a big wig. He's a real estate investor. He is a I mean, some people would maybe say he's kind of the Chinese Donald Trump, I guess, in some ways. Only it seems this guy may actually have some legitimate criminal activity that is worthy of investigation. So definitely this guy seems like a bit of a shady individual. But he also seems like quite a power player, for sure. And it's interesting now that Mr. Steve Bannon, is now linking up with this guy. And it turns out that it may actually be quite a bit more interesting than this piece laid out. And that brings me now to an interview with Roger Stone, an interview between Alex Jones on the Alex Jones Show and Roger Stone, where Roger Stone, if you don't know, is a longtime friend of President Trump. He is somebody who has been is just a famous political operative. Basically, he's been around since like the Nixon days. And he is a individual who has a vast swath of connections in Washington. Now, he is alleging something far more sinister when it comes to Miles Walk and Mr. Bannon. So I will let Roger Stone speak for himself.
Well, Alex, this is really quite extraordinary. Miles Kwok is a former Chinese intelligence operative who evidently became at some point a double agent. He evidently, allegedly, orchestrated multi-million-dollar online financial crimes in China. The Chinese government has asked the Trump administration to extradite him numerous times. We know when the Chinese premier was at Mar-a-Lago, this was on the table, and the president pledged that Kwok would be sent home to face justice. Kwok was a bundler for Hillary Clinton. Kwok also has been seen dining with George Soros. He is holed up in the opulent Sherry Netherland hotel and suite complex in New York City, fighting extradition to his home country. He was, we are told, introduced to Tony Blair by Rupert Murdoch's ex-wife. He has paid Blair a substantial amount of money to chime in opposition to his extradition to China. If you want to know why the Chinese are secretly shipping oil to North Korea, perhaps it is because the president has promised them the return of Kwok, but that H.R. McMaster and now quite obviously Steve Bannon have internally opposed that extradition. That Bannon would go to Kwok for his funding is is mind-boggling.
So, according to Roger Stone, you've got a a Chinese power player wanted in China on corruption charges, who is possibly a, who is a, potentially double and even triple agent who, who is actually not being extradited, potentially, something that was requested by the Chinese leader Xi Jinping to Trump himself, apparently, because of maybe Steve Bannon. So, and now you've got this guy, this very same guy, who's now not being extradited to China, allegedly, again by Roger Stone, because of, at least in some part, Steve Bannon. This guy is now the main fundraiser, potentially, for Steve Bannon? So, I mean, if that's true, you've got Steve Bannon working full time, basically, to legitimately undermine the President of the United States. I mean, Roger Stone said that, it could be for that reason that China is, or part of the reason that China is now illegally sending oil to North Korea. So I mean, these, there's some serious implications here. This is treasonous activity, basically. I mean, truly. And it's ironic that now you've got Bannon coming out, and apparently he was quoted as saying, that Don Jr. was treasonous. No, dude, what you apparently did is actually treasonous. So, I mean, this is just insane. You've got Bannon going from overnight being, a populist nationalist, hero to some, and just this, the left would say, or, right-wing firebrand, to now potentially being a deep state operative? Good God, welcome to 2018, guys. So, I mean, this just got super insane real quick, and now, of course, the left is going to come out, and, Steve Bannon's going to be their new hero. He went from being, the devil incarnate to, their little prop, just overnight, their wonderful little darling child. So it's just, this is just all such an insane situation. But to really boil it all down, Steve Bannon has basically destroyed himself by his own insane ambition. He thought that he was a central figure in the liberty movement, a central figure in Trump's election, a central figure of, Trump's, policies. And it's just not true. What it turns out, or what it seems like he was, in fact, is a, selfish, power-hungry narcissist who was, willing to go to pretty great lengths to actually undermine the President of the United States, through potentially working with, this Miles Kwok guy, and through leaking to the media, just doing all these things to try to prop himself up. And now, it's interesting because he wanted to prop himself up and to be, to have his mark in history, basically. Well, you actually succeeded, Steve Bannon. You're not just going to be forgotten about, as you would have if you would have just sort of faded off into the distance. And if you wouldn't have apparently been a total treacherous snake, you would have just faded off into the distance. You would have been inconsequential. You would have been one of the millions of people that were forgotten in history. Now, especially if these recent revelations come out to be true, you are now Benedict Bannon. You have now solidified yourself in history, all right, but as being on the wrong side of history, as potentially putting the entire liberty movement in peril, all for your own selfish ambitions. And now, sir, you have been absolutely demolished by conservatives across the board. If you're lucky, you can maybe, crawl to some of the liberal media. But I mean, this is just an insane, set of events that has taken place. But what really needs to happen, I think, in light of all of this, I think people need to focus on the facts. People need to understand that Steve Bannon, even if he said these things, and he probably did, he didn't bring anything new to the table. He didn't bring forward any new evidence about the Don Jr. meeting, which we know was basically opposition research, something that, as we clearly know from Hillary Clinton and the DNC, is something that goes on. It's something that happens within politics, opposition research, at all levels of politics. It's something that happens. It was not illegitimate whatsoever. Even liberal lawyers like Alan Dershowitz have came out and explained that it was a totally legitimate event. So, Steve Bannon has destroyed himself. Steve Bannon has officially self-destructed. And it is definitely a spectacular sight to see. But I implore everybody, please stay focused on the issue. By and large, this is a massive distraction, and this is going to be used by the Democrats and the media as a massive distraction. They think this is going to reinvigorate. They're trying to distance themselves from the dossier and that whole scandal, but they want to sort of try to reinvigorate the Russian scandal in other ways. So they'll use this Bannon thing to try to reinvigorate the Russian scandal, and they're also now going to use this Michael Wolff book, which is just a massive hit job, to try to say that the president is unfit to push for the 25th Amendment and to try to have him removed as the president of the United States through his cabinet and the vice president, who would all have to vote to do so. So what we need to do is we need to, as conservatives, libertarians, populists, whatever, I think focus on the issues. We need to concentrate on the fact, and it's always when there are major accomplishments to be highlighted by the Trump administration. The fact that the Dow hit 25,000 for the first time, the fact that there was 250,000 jobs created in the last jobs report, and well exceeding expectations. The fact that there's more and more people entering the workforce, unemployment is going down. All these major accomplishments that are going on, and also these massive revelations. It turns out that in fact Comey did leak classified information. You've got the Hume Abedin emails that were just revealed. You've got the reopening of the Hillary Clinton investigation. All these massive, wonderful things are happening, and of course now, just perfectly in time, to try to distract from all of that, Steve Bannon comes out and says that Don Jr. Committed treason. Just absurd, just ridiculous. Steve Bannon just destroyed himself, literally. So, Breitbart needs to dump him, obviously, and hopefully they can reform themselves afterwards. But, this is just, an insane set of events, and I hope people can stay focused on the issues, and I hope this does not wind up in any way causing any sort of division or any sort of a civil war within conservatives and libertarians in any sort of way. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe to my channel. Please share the video to any of your friends. Also, let me know what you think. Any ideas you'd like to hear for future videos, or just anything, any input. Always appreciated. If you'd like to follow me on social media, I will have the links for my Twitter and Gab account. And I will also provide the links to all the sources of the information that I put into this presentation. So, again, with that, I hope you have a wonderful day, and may the force be with you.